everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this lunchtime event on the launch or relaunch, in a sense, of the Coming Clean report presented by the Justice Center Hong Kong. I'd just like to put into context sort of how and why this work is particularly relevant from the perspective of the Center for Comparative and Public Law. As many of you would know, we have in the past produced research reports, some of the first ones in relation to forced labor and migrant workers in the Hong Kong context. Particularly, our former colleague Carol Peterson did a study on this. Others at the university have also been involved in studying the rights of migrant workers, including, again, a former colleague, Professor Amy Sim, and also Peggy Lee, both of whom have done research in this area. Last year, we also hosted the Domestic Workers Roundtable in the effort to try to better understand some of the issues that impact the rights of migrant workers, which was a group of a fairly large number of community organizations, and we invited LegCo members as well as government departmental representatives to attend the meeting, although there wasn't as much of an uptake from the government side, but the roundtable did go ahead, and we had presentations and brainstorming on a range of issues. This year, as we know, there have been several developments, including the most recently published Code of Practice, which I suppose Victoria will talk about in a moment, a Code of Practice for employment agencies who help engage some of these workers in work in Hong Kong. Our two presenters today are both from the Hong Kong Justice Center, or I should say Justice Center Hong Kong, to be correct. Victoria is the Advocacy and Campaigns Manager. She heads the organization's advocacy work, including its research and publications, lobbying to the government and public engagement, as well as community empowerment and awareness raising. And particularly, I think, powerful has been her work recently in relation to enabling capacity building with refugees to help them be their own advocates. Prior to joining the Justice Center, she worked as a human rights researcher at the Center for Economic and Social Rights in Madrid, as a consultant at the United Nations Human Settlements Program, at the Sub-Regional Office for Arab Cities in Kuwait. She holds a master's degree in international studies from the Graduate Institute of International and Developmental Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. Our other speaker is Jane Anderson, who's been working in international development and human rights work since 2002. She's worked widely in the region, particularly in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and South Africa for local and international NGOs. She's also worked with the UN Refugee Agency in Australia. Prior to doing this research project with the Justice Center Hong Kong, she worked with an international company called STAT, researching people who decide to seek asylum in Australia from Afghanistan and Iran through irregular channels. Jade holds a master's degree in applied anthropology and participatory development through the Australian National University and a master's in international development through Deakin University. I'm very excited to have you both on the panel. Please join me in welcoming them both.
Thank you. As Pooja mentioned, my name is Victoria, and I'm the Advocacy and Campaigns Manager at Justice Center Hong Kong. I think I'll first start off by giving just a brief background on who Justice Center is, so you have a better understanding of our organization, because obviously this has been a major report that has had a lot of resources and time put into it, and I think it's important that you understand why we did it as well. So we're a nonprofit human rights organization based here in Hong Kong, and our mission is to protect the rights of Hong Kong's most vulnerable forced migrants. That includes refugees, other people who are seeking protection here in Hong Kong, as well as survivors of torture, forced labor, and human trafficking. And we used to be the Hong Kong Refugee Advice Center until 2014. In 2014, we changed our name and expanded our mandate. And when we were Hong Kong Refugee Advice Center, we helped over 2,000 men, women, and children rebuild their lives. To give you some statistics, in 2015, we assisted 961 protection claimants here in Hong Kong, which includes 118 families and 216 children. And of these, 113 of them received individual legal and psychological support. But in addition to our legal services for protection claimants, we also work in advocacy, which is the area of work that I head up. An important part of advocacy is making sure that you have an evidence base. So this was one of the biggest impetus for us to do this research project, which I'll now talk about. So last March, on March 15th, we launched a report called Coming Clean. And it's the first study of its kind to estimate the prevalence of forced labor and human trafficking for the purpose of forced labor amongst domestic workers in Hong Kong. There have been many initiatives and studies done to look at some of the abuses that domestic workers face. I think the difference maybe of this study is that we actually conducted large-scale research and we've teamed up with a market research company to actually conduct the research. So that's one of the unique things about this study. Why did we do it? Well, to give you a bit of background, many of you might know some of these statistics, but in Hong Kong, there's around 340,000 domestic workers working in this city. They actually comprise 10% of the working population in Hong Kong and 4% of the general population. And 1 in 3 households with children in Hong Kong employs a domestic worker. And demand for domestic work has only increased in recent years, and there's been an increasing number of source countries that have had labor importation schemes to Hong Kong. Obviously, they play a significant and underappreciated role in Hong Kong's well-being, its society and economy, and also in their home countries. So our research actually shows that 96.8% of the respondents that we surveyed send remittances back home. And of these, about 3/4 have 3 or more people dependent on these remittances. And 87.8% of the respondents send more than 40% of their monthly earnings back home in remittances. So remittances that these domestic workers send is enormous in sustaining the well-being of families back home. Well, I'm going to give you a bit of a background on the context here in Hong Kong. So I think many of you know who this person is. This is the case of Erwiana, who is a domestic worker that really represents one of the most extreme forms of abuse that we've seen. It was a case study that came to light in January 2013. And her name has really become synonymous with some of the most extreme forms of labor exploitation here in Hong Kong. However, the government often treats these cases of abuse as rare occurrences. So we've seen that cases like hers are considered cases of bad apples, be they the employers or the employment agencies. However, a lot of concern groups have also pointed out that cases like hers, yes, they might be extreme, but they're actually the tip of the iceberg of a larger exploitation. And I think the challenge is that we've only, with these case studies, you don't really have a sense of scale of the problems. And that's what our study aimed to address in a statistically significant way. And again, if you only put the issue as being bad apples, it gives a certain inevitability to the problem, because there's always going to be bad apples in societies. But really, the source of the problem is not so much that just there's bad apples, but rather there are policies and laws that are failing that make people vulnerable to being exploited by bad apples. And that's what our recommendations seek to address. So Hong Kong has been criticized, and there have been concerns by different human rights actors about the situation of human trafficking and forced labor in the territory, particularly towards domestic workers. And one of the most recent notable examples of this was the concluding observations that were made to Hong Kong only late last year by the UN Committee Against Torture. And there's a specific section in the concluding observations on trafficking in persons and forced labor of domestic workers. So that link, we haven't seen it so explicitly in previous concluding observations as in these last recommendations by CAT. And in their observations, they said that the committee is concerned about numerous reports of cases of exploitation of migrant domestic workers It regrets also that Hong Kong, China continues to maintain immigration policies that could contribute to the risk of forced labor, such as the live-in requirement in the employing household and the 2-week rule, whereby domestic workers have to leave the territory within 2 weeks upon termination of their contracts. And we've also seen that in the US State Department's Trafficking in Persons report, ever since 2009, Hong Kong has been downgraded to Tier 2 in this report. And this report is aimed at looking not so much at outcomes, but efforts made by governments to combat human trafficking. Now, in response to many of these concerns, be they by treaty bodies or experts or civil society, the government has often stated that there's no evidence to suggest that Hong Kong is a destination, transit, and source territory for human trafficking and forced labor. So what this study aimed to do was really understand the evidence. Are we talking about bad apples, or are we talking about the tip of the iceberg? Where's the truth? What does the data tell us? And to what degree do these abusive practices cumulatively constitute forced labor or trafficking for the purpose of forced labor? Because it's not enough to have one individual labor violation to necessarily be in a situation of forced labor. So that was also what this study aimed to address. And to be quite honest, that was, I think, one of the most challenging things in doing the methodology and coming up with the research design is, okay, when would someone trigger or fall into forced labor according to our study? That took quite a bit of thought, and my colleague Jade will go into it now. So I'll turn the word to Jade to walk you through the methodology. The report itself has a section on the methodology, but one of our aims was to be as transparent as possible with our methodology. So online, we have several appendices that are also available, like the survey instrument, our calculation methods, list of indicators, and more. So you can find a lot more on our website as well.
Thanks, Victoria. So as Victoria said, I'm going to try and talk you through the methodology in a little bit more detail. So we developed our methodology after extensive consultations with a number of different organisations, including the International Labour Organization and UNACT, the UN Anti-Trafficking Organization. And we decided after these consultations that we would base our methodology around the Forced Labour Convention and the legal definition of forced labour contained therein. The Forced Labour Convention defines forced labour as all work or service exacted from any person under the menace of penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. What we set out to do in our research project was to operationalise that definition. According to the most recent and the most comprehensive guidelines developed by the International Labour Organization on how to operationalise that definition, when you're looking for somebody in forced labour, you're looking for somebody who shows sufficient indicators in any one of the 3 dimensions of forced labour. So this is unfree recruitment, work and life under duress, or impossibility of leaving. These 3 dimensions relate to the work cycle. So for the purpose of this research, Justice Centre defined a migrant domestic worker as being in forced labour if she or he had not been recruited into the job freely, was not doing the job freely, or could not walk away from the job freely. Justice Centre also made the decision to distinguish between trafficked and non-trafficked forms of forced labour in order to better understand the degree of vulnerability along the migration path. For our purposes, a migrant domestic worker had been trafficked for the purpose of forced labour if they were positive in the dimension of unfree recruitment and at least one of the other 2 dimensions. So to be counted as trafficked for the purpose of forced labour, they needed to have experienced unfree recruitment and work and life under duress, or impossibility of leaving. For our research then, victims of trafficking for the purpose of forced labour were a subset of those respondents we considered in forced labour. Sorry. We've included all of this in the report as Victoria outlined, and if you've got a copy of the report, what I'm about to show you starts on page 38 of the report. But here you can see the full list of the indicators that we use to determine the presence or absence of forced labour. This first set is the indicators for unfree recruitment, and if you'll recall in the definition of forced labour, there needed to be the presence of menace of penalty as well as the presence of involuntariness, according to the legal definition. So there's two lists of indicators for unfree recruitment. On the left-hand side, you'll see the involuntariness indicators, and on the right-hand side, you'll see the indicators which are menace of penalty indicators. You will also note that there are two shades of yellow being used. The darker shade represents indicators which are weighted as strong indicators, and the lighter shade are indicators which are weighted medium. So in terms of determining whether a respondent met the definition of being in forced labour, they have to show both involuntariness indicators and menace of penalty indicators, and at least one of those indicators needs to be strong. So it's a fairly complicated process. This shows you the work and life under duress indicators. Again, the darker shade are the strong indicators and the lighter shade are the medium indicators. And this is the impossibility of leaving indicators. I should point out that we surveyed only migrant domestic workers who were currently employed. So that's why the list of indicators for impossibility of leaving is so small. There are actually, the list that we could choose from of indicators is actually much more extensive, but we were limited in the scope of questions that we could ask respondents because they were all currently employed and not necessarily seeking to leave their current contract. So to summarise, to be counted as working in conditions of forced labour, a respondent would need to trigger at least one indicator of involuntariness and at least one indicator of menace of penalty, and at least one of those indicators would need to be weighted strong in any of the three dimensions: work and life under duress, unfree recruitment, or impossibility of leaving. To be counted as working in forced labour, the respondent needed to be positive for only one of those dimensions, or at least one of those dimensions. To be counted as trafficked for the purpose of forced labour, the respondent would need to be positive for unfree recruitment and at least one other of the dimensions. As Victoria said, there's obviously a lot of detail here, and there's a lot more information about it in the report itself and in the online appendices, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask us at any point. I want to talk now a little bit about how we actually conducted the research. All of the calculations included in the report are based on responses to a closed question survey, which we administered to 1,003 migrant domestic workers throughout Hong Kong. We strove for the sample to be as representative as possible, so quotas were set for the inclusion of migrant domestic workers by nationality based on the proportion of the population in Hong Kong. So you'll see 51% of our sample were from the Philippines, 46% were from Indonesia, and 3% were from some of the other countries, the other countries where migrant domestic workers come from to work in Hong Kong. We had 11 geographical areas across Hong Kong, and we employed systematic sampling techniques at each location. Surveys were administered by a reputable market research company using e-tablets, and the survey was translated into the language of the respondent. On average, the survey took between 20 and 40 minutes to complete, and the sample size and the sampling technique provides findings which can be reported to a 95% confidence level, plus or minus a 3.1% margin of error. Now, as I said, all of the results included in the report are based on the closed question survey. But in addition to that closed question survey, we also conducted a series of qualitative focus groups with 46 migrant domestic workers through various different organisations in Hong Kong to validate some of the findings and to discuss the findings in a lot more depth. I should caution that, as with any research, there are limits to this study. It is likely that migrant domestic workers who are most at risk are the least likely to participate, unfortunately, in this type of research. In addition, migrant domestic workers, like other types of respondents, might not feel comfortable disclosing sensitive information, for example, about abuse during the recruitment process or abuse in their working environment to a complete stranger in a once-off interview. So it is likely that the Justice Centre estimates are conservative estimates. And to reiterate, there's a lot more detail to the methodology, and you're welcome to contact us or peruse the online appendices to your heart's content. I want to turn now to the findings from the research and I'll start with the more general findings. I've just noticed, sorry, the font is completely different. So I'm going to begin with some general findings. Justice Centre found that on average, migrant domestic workers were working 11.9 hours a day, 6 days a week. So that amounts to almost 72 hours a week.
And this is excluding rest time?
Yes. The question was phrased in such a way to purposely exclude any rest times allocated to the domestic worker. More than a third of our respondents were not given a full 24-hour rest period as per the law on their one-day rest week. 39.3% reported that they did not have any personal space in the household, so they weren't given their own room. And only 6.1% of respondents had salaries above the minimum allowable wage at the time of the survey. Obviously, there is no legal requirement that employers increase salaries mid-contract in line with any increases to the minimum allowable wage. But what we can say is that the minimum allowable wage is not really seen as the minimum floor, it's actually being treated as the norm. In addition to that, of those respondents who were receiving a cash food allowance in lieu of sharing food with the family, 57.7%, so almost 60%, were receiving less than the minimum food allowance at the time of the survey, and most of those were receiving substantially less than the minimum food allowance at the time of the survey. Again, there's no legal requirement that it be increased, but what we did see was that the minimum food allowance, the cash allowance, was one of the ways in which migrant domestic workers were being systematically underpaid. 31.9% of migrant domestic workers in this survey did not feel free to quit their current contracts. Of those who did not feel free to quit, for some it was because their employment agencies still had their passports. For some it was because the employment agency had told them they weren't allowed to quit. For others it was because they still had recruitment debt. For many it was because they were worried it looked bad to change employers in Hong Kong. And for another subset, it was because they felt that all jobs in Hong Kong were like this, and so there was no point to quitting. I want to turn now to our estimations of the prevalence rates of forced labour and trafficking for the purpose of forced labour amongst the general population of migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong. Justice Centre calculated that 17% of migrant domestic workers surveyed displayed all of the indicators required to be counted in forced labour. That is 1 in 6. Extrapolated to the general population, that's equivalent to over 50,000 migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong who may be working in conditions of forced labour. Of those in forced labour, 40% had been trafficked into that situation, that experienced unfree recruitment and were experiencing work and life under duress or impossibility of leaving once they'd arrived in Hong Kong. In addition to that, 66.3% of respondents, so the overwhelming majority, were experiencing at least one strong indicator of forced labour or trafficking for the purpose of forced labour, but they didn't meet the threshold to be counted as being in forced labour. And an additional 11.3% of respondents were positive for at least one medium indicator, but they didn't have enough, again, to cross the threshold. Only 5.4% of respondents were showing no signs of working in conditions of forced labour in Hong Kong. Looking at our findings by dimension, you'll remember the yellow is unfree recruitment, blue is work and life under duress, and the orange is impossibility of leaving. So of our respondents, 92 respondents were positive for unfree recruitment. They had experienced unfree recruitment for their current contract in Hong Kong. 100 respondents were experiencing work and life under duress, and 4 respondents were experiencing impossibility of leaving. As you noticed before, the range of questions and the range of indicators that we were trying to assess for impossibility of leaving was quite small. So it's likely that that's underrepresented in this sample, impossibility of leaving. It should also be clear from these results that forced labour is not just a problem of recruitment, it is as much a problem as of work and life conditions in Hong Kong. So 100 respondents were positive for work and life under duress, and 92 respondents were positive for unfree recruitment, so it's almost equal. In the report, I think it's on page 56, we include 3 case studies. We won't go through them in any detail now, but they are quite helpful in showing how the indicators work and how we use those indicators to assess the cases of individual respondents. Each of the included case studies represents an actual respondent to this survey. We have tweaked some of the personal details to make sure we protected the anonymity of respondents. I am now going to pass it back to Victoria so that she can... Oh, sorry, actually, there's one more thing that I wanted to talk you through, which was looking at some of the analysis that we did of the findings and working out where the points of vulnerability were. So what we found was that migrant domestic workers who had excessive recruitment debt, we defined excessive recruitment debt as debt which was recruitment debt which was equal to or exceeding 30% of their reported annual income. So migrant domestic workers who had excessive recruitment debt were 6 times more likely to be in forced labour. In fact, that was one of the biggest predictors of whether somebody would fall into forced labour. Whereas those in forced labour had an average monthly repayment of $1,278 per month. Those not in forced labour had an average monthly repayment of recruitment debt of only $322. Migrant domestic workers from Indonesia were 70.5% more likely than non-Indonesians to be in a situation of forced labour, which brings to mind the 2013 Amnesty International report regarding the situation of migrant domestic workers from Indonesia and Hong Kong. Although the majority of respondents secured their job in Hong Kong, 62% of those in forced labour had secured their contract outside of Hong Kong. So those who secured their contract in their home country were 15.4% more likely to be working in conditions of forced labour. Of those on their first contract in Hong Kong, 2.7 times, they were 2.7 times more likely than those with previous working experience in Hong Kong to be working in conditions of forced labour. Age also played a role and is probably related to experience. Migrant domestic workers younger than 30 were 52.8% more likely to be in forced labour, and those younger than 24 years old are 15 times more likely to be working in conditions of forced labour. Of interest, Justice Centre did not find a relationship between migrant domestic workers in forced labour and education levels or their work experience. So of those in forced labour, 28% had attended up to tertiary level education, and all of them had received at least their Year 12 leaving certificate. And of those in forced labour, 37.4% had actually worked in other countries before coming to Hong Kong. So now I am going to turn it back to Victoria to talk you through some of the conclusions and recommendations.
So again, as Jade had mentioned, we did both a quantitative survey, but we also felt it was very important to validate the findings and have a participatory approach to the research by doing qualitative focus groups with domestic workers to show them some of the initial findings, hear what they thought about it, and also to help us shape the recommendations. And in these qualitative focus groups, one of the questions that we asked them was, what does decent work look like to you? So if you had a perfect day in your job, and I asked them to draw it actually first, and then we had a discussion, what would that look like? And what I have here are some of the answers that they said during these discussions. So on the continuum of forced labor, you have extreme forms of labor exploitation and human trafficking on one end, but on the other end, you have decent work. And I think it was very clear that everyone, including domestic workers, want to be engaged in meaningful and productive work and to be able to realize their potential through their work. In the focus groups, we met with a lot of domestic workers who actually described their job with pride, who were very happy with their employer, who were having a great time in Hong Kong. But we also talked, and they talked about how lucky they were. But we also talked to a lot of people who, were actually leaving situations of abuse. So we went to sub-shelters and to NGOs who provide support to people to be able to file claims, for example. And these people, they talked about their bad experiences as being unlucky. So this idea of luck really came out quite strongly to us. And it seemed like upon signing to become a domestic worker in Hong Kong, it was like entering into a lottery. And whether, the difference between having a good working experience and a bad working experience, or potentially one of forced labor, came down to this luck of the draw. So for us, it really reinforced that this idea of helplessness if you're stuck in a situation of exploitation. And it's really important that we can't allow preventing forced labor to come down to fate and the luck of the draw. There needs to be better policies and laws in place. So, and I'm sorry about this. I think we've had some problems with the font. But we draw several conclusions in the last chapter of the report that are based on both the quantitative and the qualitative findings. And we detail these out a bit more in each of the sections in the report, but basically there are four key conclusions, which is that the live-in requirement makes migrant domestic workers uniquely vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, and forced labor. And what we found was excessive working hours was one of the most common indicators that was flagged to our study. And our study did give a lot of weight to the impact the live-in requirement has on creating multiple forms of dependency on the employer, which is one of the indicators here, for both work and non-work life. And although this study cannot conclusively establish whether placement agencies overcharge the worker in the individual respondents' answers, what we do see is that high levels of debt incurred by the respondents exceeds many legal limits, both here in Hong Kong and in source countries. And we saw that there's debt that's accumulated both in source countries and in Hong Kong. So debt happens here in Hong Kong. A lot of times there are public statements that make it seem like it's only a problem of source countries, but that's not what the findings show. It raises warning flags about rampant overcharging. And debt is clearly a vulnerability to forced labor when you run the statistics. Even in source countries where high debt levels may actually be legal, it creates a vulnerability of the worker to exploitative practices by the recruitment agency or exploitation by the employer, because they have to get rid of the debt. We also note that even when there's no debt that's incurred, when someone uses their savings, some costs of having put hard-earned savings also factors into the decision maker of the worker. The 2-week rule obliges domestic workers to leave Hong Kong within 14 days of the termination of their contract. And it creates an entire industry around domestic workers with opportunities for agencies, moneylenders, and other intermediary parties to extract profit and collect fees. Combined with the rigidness of not being able to change employers easily, the 2-week rule actually plays a disincentive from the domestic worker to terminate the contract if they're in an abusive situation, particularly those who shoulder a high debt burden, who are those who are also most vulnerable to forced labor. And really, it's actually the confluence, the nexus of all these factors together, when combined, that make people, domestic workers, uniquely vulnerable. And it shows that forced labor can happen even in a place like Hong Kong that actually has a very regulated temporary migration scheme. One of the biggest sources of the problems that we found was that Hong Kong actually has no specific legislation prohibiting forced labor or human trafficking for the purpose of forced labor, and this is a very big legal gap. So we don't have time to go through all the recommendations, but we grouped these recommendations into 4 key areas. There are 20 recommendations in total, and I'll just go through some of the top line messages. But the first is that Hong Kong really should take steps to combat human trafficking and forced labor in the Hong Kong SAR territory. And you can, just to let you know, you can find the recommendations on page 70 and 71 of the report. And one of the first things that I think would make a big difference is if the government acknowledged that there was a problem. So every time there are concerns that are raised, if it merits a press release from the government, they often say that existing legislation and policies are sufficient and that there's no evidence. So if there were an acknowledgement of the problem, I think that would be a very welcome first step. And it would be a good thing to conduct a formal review to see how existing laws and policies are actually working. So these are some of the recommendations that we make in the report. But in addition, we do think that there should be specific legislation to prohibit forced labor and human trafficking for forced labor in Hong Kong. Our report calls for better measures to monitor and sanction recruitment and employment agencies. We also call to ensure that domestic workers are able to enjoy just and favorable conditions of work. And ultimately, I think that one of the challenges here is there's a rampant perception that domestic help, as it's often called, is not work. And domestic work is work. It should be treated as work, and workers should be treated as workers and afforded the same other rights as workers. I think the ILO Convention 189, the Domestic Workers Convention that came out entered into force a couple of years ago, serves as a very useful human rights instrument that we can refer to for labor standards on domestic work. And also we call for the government to grant conditions of stay that allow domestic workers more flexibility to be able to change employer and also to be able to seek redress if they have been victim to labor exploitation. I just wanted to note some recent developments since our report came out. So in the I guess you might have a question on the impact of our report. I think what really surprised me was there was a lot of international media coverage on the report. So the report was featured in pretty much every international newspaper, the New York Times, the Guardian, CNN, Wall Street Journal. I could go on. I was actually quite taken aback by the international coverage. In equal measure, I was surprised by the lack of coverage in local media. And it didn't even make front page of SEMP. That to me was very disappointing. It was very disappointing. However, it did merit a press release from the government. We have had some positive traction with the sending country governments. Unfortunately, we haven't yet been able to meet with the different departments in the Hong Kong government, but I do hope that we can have these meetings because I think the findings would actually be very useful for their work, and we want to make sure that the data can be used by key stakeholders. What we have seen is that there's been traction on the regulation of employment agencies. So the government in the past month, actually a couple weeks after the report, came out with the draft code of practice for employment agencies. And I just got a copy of this week. And there's going to be a consultation period until June 17th on this. And there's going to be a meeting in the panel of manpower in a couple weeks' time for public submissions, public consultation process on this. So this is a positive measure. There have been many concerns raised about whether a code of practice is enough because it's not legally enforceable, and that's perhaps a limitation. But it is a welcome first step, and we'll surely be engaging in this process. The other thing is that we have, ironically, because it relates to our other area of work, seen an increasing link made to the Hong Kong government between human trafficking in relation to the unified screening mechanism and refugee and other protection claims. I could probably talk about this at length, but that is a trend that we're seeing. So this is, I think, an interesting development. We're all awaiting a decision by the High Court. So in January, there was a case of a person who sought to challenge the Hong Kong government's failure to pass laws and policies to protect victims. And he claims that he was brought to work as a domestic worker, but was actually then made to work in an office in a situation of forced labor. And he alleges that he tried to seek assistance from various departments in Hong Kong, but each department failed to investigate his case. So that decision, the judicial review took place in January, and we're waiting for a judgment to be handed down. And obviously, one thing that we'll be also looking to is the TIP report's annual ranking, and to see where Hong Kong fits. In the past, there's been rumors to see if Hong Kong might be downgraded to Tier 2 watch. So far, it's just been steadily at Tier 2, but this will be an interesting thing to keep an eye out for. So ultimately, we hope that what our report can do, it's not here to cast blame or to criticize. It's actually, we're hoping that the data can serve as an evidence base for advocacy and policy and law change. And we hope that it can actually open a dialogue for concerted action. So with that, I think that we'll take questions that you may have on the report.
Thank you very much, Jade and Victoria. It's invaluable, I think, to finally have a set of data, and particularly one which is predicated on such a strong methodological exercise and instrument, and one which is transparent. So I'm sure that different stakeholders would find it very, very useful to draw on this material. Thank you also for presenting this at-length report in the short space of time. I think it's given us a lot to sort of think about. We have around 15 minutes for question and answers. You're most welcome. Yes.
Right. You've talked about presenting this to the government, and you've talked about the discussions you've had with the domestic workers. you haven't said much about the employers. I mean, if you sit down with this report and present it to the employers and say, have you realised that 12 hours a day is actually a very long working day? What's the employer's response to your point? And if you sort of enter into dialogue with the employers, does that tend to change their employment mentality as an employer?
We can both take turns. Yeah, no, you're totally right. It's there are many different parties, and it is an employer-employee relationship, right? I think we were limited in our study by how much we could do, a survey per se with employers. But I think it does. The findings merit more engagement with employers. I was hoping that a first step, because we also have limited capacity, would be to have local media interest and reporting on the study. So, and we did do the press release in Chinese. We did do networking with Chinese language journalists, but we didn't get much traction. So I think that is still a gap that we need to be working on, is to try to get more media stories and interest, because that's actually a very important public education tool in a way. I also think that it does merit a need to do more public awareness raising with the employers. And one of the things that this study calls for in the recommendations is training provided not just to the domestic workers on their rights and responsibilities, but also this should happen with the employers, and that's not really happening right now in Hong Kong. On the employer side of the story, because obviously this will come out in the public consultation on the employment agencies, also the employment agency side of the story. When we did the press release for this report, I thought it was very important that there be a diverse group of stakeholders at the table. So I made sure in the press release, in the press conference, that we had a representative from the employer side. So we had Doris Lee from Open Door, who represents an organization of employers, also wanting better protection of domestic workers, seeing that it can be a win-win situation to have a happy helper in your household for sustainability, and also sharing a lot of concerns about the employment agencies. We had them speak. We also had someone from a local trade union as well, and we had a migrant rights activist at the table too, as well as a politician. So I think you're right. There needs to be a multi-stakeholder dialogue. I also think that the Domestic Worker Roundtable was a good example of this, and I think we did have some employer associations come to it. Unfortunately, the missing actor really was the Hong Kong government. We had sending country governments, we had trade unions, academics, lawyers, everybody except the Hong Kong government.
Nothing to add to that question? Yes, I guess.
Just, you mentioned the criteria, the work and life under duress, and I'm trying to picture that a little bit in terms of what kind of questions you might have asked. Was that part of the quantitative, or did more of that come out in the qualitative part of your study?
So all of the results that we reported now come out of the survey. So for example, we sought to capture, within the limits of time, capture as complete a picture of an average working day for respondents. We asked questions about working hours, rest times. We asked questions about what, if you did something wrong, what did your employer do? Had your employer ever threatened to or actually locked you in your room, deducted wages? We asked a fairly extensive range of questions to try to assess those indicators and to try and measure whether respondents were experiencing work and life under duress. And so if you recall in the definition, because they have to have menace of penalty and involuntariness, the range of questions has to be quite extensive. To give you an example, we asked, does your employer keep your passport? And if the respondent said yes, then we said, do you actually have access to it? Whenever you want to, could you go in and get your passport? And if the respondent said no, then that triggers an indicator. If the respondent said yes, you know, for example, yes, I asked my employer to keep my passport because it's safer, you know, with the files, but they can walk into the room and get their passport at any time, then that doesn't trigger an indicator.
And we put, so not all the questions triggered an indicator, some routed then to other questions. So we had different levels just to make sure that we were really being quite stringent in in really capturing the indicator. And in the survey instrument we have online, we identify where a certain survey question triggers the indicator. We have kind of an annotated version of it. And one of our big issues was, okay, we have to make sure we ask the right questions. And there are a lot of questions that would have been interesting to know, but not crucial to have to calculate what we were seeking, so we had to shave some things off. But I think ultimately what we did is we really, at the beginning when we were doing the survey instrument, we were drafting it, we consulted quite a bit with a lot of the domestic worker groups here in Hong Kong, and they really helped shape the questions that we asked. And the initial draft of the survey questionnaire, we ran it by the market research company, and they actually had a lot of suggestions on how to make sure we worded it in the most neutral terms, so that we don't have actually, you know,
we're not leading respondents to answer in a
bias.
particular way.
Yes, Neera? Hi, thank you for that. A lot of detail, but I'm sure there's a lot more in the report. My question was about the sending countries. What has been the response from there? I know that there's been a lot of work over the last, since last year with the sending countries. Has there been anything positive, any positive developments there?
Yeah, I'll talk maybe mostly just about the response to the report. They also, have their own initiatives that they're doing to try to work on the situation. I think the roundtable has created a bit of energy with the sending country governments. But before the report came out, a day before, we actually gave an embargoed copy to all the sending country governments and the Hong Kong government, to various departments. And we got some meetings with sending country governments, and I won't name them, but we did get closer meetings. And then we also had a diplomatic roundtable a couple weeks ago, and we invited, not just sending country governments, but also just important consulates here in Hong Kong to brief them on the report, and it got a very strong turnout. I think that the data from the study is actually useful to a lot of the sending country governments, and there's certain data that we haven't included, but that we could give, because there's also, if we included all the data, it'd be a 500-page report, but also just disaggregating certain averages by nationality, and that's the spirit that I'd like to see the report be received, is that it's a useful tool for policymakers. So I'm hopeful that we can get the same traction with the Hong Kong government, but it's been a bit more difficult to get a forum. After the report came out, for example, the Philippines consulate, they put out a press statement, and also their labor ministry put out its own press statement as well.
And to add to that, they have also requested more data. So they've engaged with Justice Centre to ask about this data related specifically to their nationals. So there is actually a lot of interest from the sending country governments.
If I could just add, just putting it into context, with the Domestic Worker Roundtable, as Victoria said, we had representatives from every the main sending government present, but the Hong Kong government didn't come. And the basis for their non-attendance was grounded in the fact that, we have government-to-government relationships already in place with each of the sending countries, so there's no need for us to come to a public forum to meet the same people again and to talk shop, because we're already doing it. And of course, our point was, well, since a lot of the stakeholders face similar situations and circumstances, it's just each country is at different stages of it. So Philippines, the workers tend to be much more rights aware to some extent, and they have a longer standing experience in Hong Kong as domestic workers. Indonesians, you can see from the data already that, you know, they're still sort of teething into the process, and there are some classic telltale signs of vulnerability. So that was sort of the context then. And what, I mean, again, as Victoria says, what the report does is it gives sending countries now the data they need to push the Hong Kong government to say, you know, we've been saying, or we've been seeing patterns for years, but here, you know, you've got data to back up this sort of, you know, the conjecture that our workers are not faring very well here. So I'd be curious to see how the government chooses to engage, and whether it does so publicly or behind closed doors. And it does seem, unfortunately, that the Hong Kong government wants to continue the, you know, government to government level rather than an intergovernment and interdepartmental level discussion. You know, as you can see, this is not just about labor rights, but also to do with immigration and a whole range of other aspects impacting the situation of domestic workers. So the question is, how do you sort of leverage what you have here to bring the Hong Kong government to the table, so that you can have all those conversations in one go, rather than working at it on a piecemeal sort of basis.
And in silos.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think seeing the nexus between immigration rules and labour rules is really important, and I think it's one of the crucial areas of vulnerability for migrant domestic workers.
But I think this is also where there has been this constant denial about, you know, the situation of domestic helpers as having anything to do with the human trafficking problem. There's really been a very, I think, concerted attempt to keep the two separate. And what the roundtable and a lot, you know, and the report sort of threatens to do is to put it back again together and say that Hong Kong does need to work on anti-trafficking laws for the purposes of forced labor. So that conversation is one which is clearly uncomfortable, but needs to be put back on the table for discussion.
Right, so it's a positive measure that there is now focus, and I think, you know, a degree of public will by the government to look at the recruitment agencies and regulation. But that, even if they address that, that won't be enough. There's still other factors, and I think that's important that we also, as civil society, make sure that we demand that ultimately this issue of human trafficking and forced labor also needs to be addressed.
It's time for one last question. Yes, Alex.
The report was really interesting, and thanks very much for producing it. I would have one question about the law on human trafficking. I mean, that's really crucial to prove the case of human trafficking, is that the intention by the trafficker to exploit the person. And I know you do touch on that in the report, that that's actually missing. But I mean, how do you think, if that's figured into it, that would impact on your figures for human trafficking in the report? I say that because the convictions for human trafficking are notoriously low. I know in the UK it's like 4 a year. So there is a problem there in the classification.
Yeah, and I think it's a very difficult question, particularly with migrant domestic workers, because there are so many actors involved at so many different stages. So you're right, it is actually very difficult to ascertain whether a particular actor at any given stage of the process intended for there to be a final outcome of exploitation. I think there's a lot of discussion around trafficking, whether that's actually necessary for a case to be considered as one of trafficking, and there's a lot of debate about those questions.
Okay, well, thank you all for your participation, and particularly Victoria and Jade for sharing your report with us, and for furthering, I think, this discussion. And we hope that the conversations can continue. Please join me in thanking both of them.